And I request Dr. T. Sundararaman to facilitate the session.
Thank you for this invitation and this opportunity to share some thoughts on this topic. As I understand it, I present an overview for about 15 minutes, and then I call upon, of the 3 speakers, there will be 2 who are attending today, so we have more time for discussion, who would then come in on 15 minutes. You can maybe more comfortable seeing it from there. And then we would move on to I'll introduce the speakers after that, and then you would be able to have a discussion at the end of their presentations. We've covered much ground in the earlier talk, and I'm in some sense going to recapitulate some of the things, but also be more consciously addressing a community of researchers on how we look at this issue, how we look at the questions, and how we are able to take forward. This is an interesting experience. It's not only while I was in NHSRC and State Health Resource Center, directly interacting with policy makers in a space which we designed as the boundary organization. Boundary because it's in the boundary between academics and practice. You know that when the practitioners say that, look, you're all academic, and the academicians say, look, you're all practitioners. And you wish it was the other way around, but in fact, boundary organizations have this dual identity, one leg in the world of implementation and one leg in the world of academics. Now, from there I have moved into a much more direct space in academics where I teach health policy. And when I teach health policy, we have a course of 6 months or something called the field practicum, where we actually put 20 students in situations where they actually convert policy into an understanding, build policy briefs for key people, policy makers, converting and interpreting evidence and using it to actually advance the cause of policy. So from the insights of these, reflecting on it, I have a few insights to share with you. The first point is something I started with in the morning presentation also, that policy making is less arbitrary than commonly perceived. If I take you through a few examples on that. In fact, I did look at the formulation of health policy in the morning session. But if you look at the formulation of the National Rural Health Mission and the National Urban Health Mission, you can see this. At many times people say, who suddenly came, where did they do up, where was there an evidence basis for it? It was actually not like that. In 2004, there was an electoral victory. There was a change of government. Its manifesto had called for certain pro-poor actions. There were multiple interpretations of what that action was to be. There was a national advisory committee that was making its strong recommendations. There was actually an already existing program called the RCH2, which had been just designed and was to be floated. The government of India put up a particular formulation of what the NHM should be in response to the political directive. And as soon as that was put up, a delegation of civil society led by the redoubtable NH Anthiya with another 8 people went and met the Prime Minister's office and said, this just won't do, this is not the spirit, this is not the way you think about community health workers, and asked for a review of the whole program. It was mediated by a very important joint secretary who had been, now no more, but who had been joint secretary in the Rajiv Gandhi mission in Madhya Pradesh. And they therefore sent the policy document back, the NHM framework back, and set up 9 task forces. Each task force had a number of representations for a lot of civil society organizations. Given the tune of those times, there was a conscious decision that none of them will have a representative of any development partner or international agency, unusual in those times. because there was the RCH2 and it had to be signed off on that. These task forces submitted their reports. These reports were spun together into a framework of action. And like framework of actions, if you will see it has all sorts of things in it, because when you are reconciling different pulls and pushes, if you want, you can read even the current policy into that policy document. It has that space. But eventually, it also matters what got amplified and what got projected to it. So it was actually quite a political process, and there was around the table a whole lot of contestation. For example, the ASHA task force had something like 18 people, and everyone knew to speak and had fight and their implementation, so it went on. But the curious thing is what happened with NUHM, the National Urban Health Mission, which was decided at the same time, same place, so to speak, that it will be conducted. It was announced, but the cabinet note for NRHM, which started in 2014-15, got passed by July 2016. The NUHM note got passed in 2013, 7 years later. For 7 years, that note went back and forth, did all the rounds of the Planning Commission, the Finance Ministry, the Prime Minister's office, back again, consultations, and it would move and finally got passed. And what was it that actually held up the NUHM? There were two critical issues. In NRHM, a position could be taken that the private sector had a minimal role, because in rural areas, the organized private sector was very limited. And you could also say that the local bodies had a limited role, because the local body capacity was not the same. But in urban areas, neither of these contentions were effective enough, and therefore the stalemate was rather complete. A stalemate that we see into the national health policy today. But at some point, this whole thing, and how do you actually reconcile this issue? So the point that I am saying is that actually there are bodies. There was at that time the Planning Commission, the Niti Aayog. There is a structure of decision making here, and there is a structure, and people do bring evidence to the table and argue it. So you look at the formulation of 5-year plans, now not there, but whatever equivalent, there will be plans. You see again a very laid down, formalized structure, presentations, background papers, notes which are prepared. I am not saying therefore that we are getting good policies, far from it. Far from it. That is not the point that I am making. But first we must concede that there is a system at work and it is not random. Because if there is a system at work, you know how to engage with it. If you think it is random, you have a sense of helplessness. That's an important point that I just wanted to make on this. So it's a question of who makes policy, on what basis they make it, what objectives they make, what are the priorities set and strategies arrive at. But there is another layer of policy making, that is what is policy de facto as practiced. How was it interpreted? How did it get implemented in each context? So you see the NRHM framework, it has lots of things in it. But some parts get amplified, some part gets attenuated. And this process of amplification and attenuation is very critical in the way a policy gets rolled out. And then you have a sense of what is it injected, what are the priorities on that. And critical to understanding this is the notion of policy as a process of power and its negotiation. Policy makers balance between stakeholders who they are conscious of the fact that they are representative of a thing. It's not that they are not aware of their bias and their predilections. They are very often going to tell you that, look, I hear all that, but I'm convinced it's this way. But they have not done thing. But they are also consider objective facts. And at some point, policy is made by the powerful, but it's not made in a vacuum. It all times has to relate to other stakeholders on the table. It all times has to relate to public perception. One good piece in the newspaper can cause an alert to... So it's not as if at some point it's not that the interests of the powerful will be compromised, but at some point it is really an issue. But it is not made in a certain area of lack of awareness. So this notion that policy is made without information and you supply information and you get better policy is inherently very flawed. So if policymakers listen to evidence, that does not mean they necessarily follow it. And evidence, though, alters the balance of powers at the negotiating table. So if you look at 5 people who are pushing things, so if somebody comes up and says, we need public-private partnerships. So an officer can politely say, yes, sir, we are completely committed to it. But you know, the problem is last 20 years, all these particular PPPs have failed. Maybe we shall do it differently this time. And then at some point we'll have to mention it, and you have to be aware that you can have a failure of this magnitude, and that actually sets a dialogue. Now, for example, look at insurance. It's a current topic. The last budget speech announced a national health insurance. There's an overwhelming evidence that has come in on what is happening with publicly funded health insurance. Almost all representations of that are pretty weak. We have one speaker that we have skipped on, so there's some space on that. So there is at some point you know that. Having said that, that does not prevent that particular policy from coming into place. But what it does is, it alters the way it can be rolled out, it alters the form, it brings certain cautions. It allows policymakers to actually, people who are deciding at different levels, to interpret it much more carefully on that. This is a very interesting quotation I have from Capital. Not Karl Marx Capital, but Thomas Piketty's Capital. Okay. Social science research will always be tentative and imperfect. It does not claim to transform the domain into an exact science. By patiently searching for factors and patterns and calmly analyzing the economic, social, and political mechanisms that might explain them, it can inform democratic debate and focus attention on the right questions. It can help us redefine the terms of the debate, unmask certain preconceived or fraudulent notions, and subject all positions to critical scrutiny. I think it's a fairly good expression of the relationship between evidence, between research, what actually it does, and the making of policy. It sets up and redefines the terms of a democratic discourse. But at some point, it is not the one that makes the policy. It only the way it alters the making of policy that's very critical in its understanding to it. I find this particularly a good expression. In some sense, if we understand, it's still more democratic than, it still underplays the power structure in this quotation. This democracy is not of equal people, but that being understood, and as Piketty also understand it. So I then come to the question for how do researchers, academics set their objectives? What can researchers do better? If this is the way in which play of decision making occurs, how do we as researchers position ourselves and how do we think about it, it can do better? One thing is really going beyond the obvious, and far too much research is really capturing in literary text the obvious. Much of public health research is descriptive. Researcher's solution is the policymaker's problem statement, the first level of inquiry. Solutions proposed by researchers have already been tried and have not really worked. And very often this is a situation that you are saying, so the prescriptive one has a problem that many of it has been tried. But understanding why these things have been tried but has not worked really engages you with the research. But then when you come out with it of what should be the state to be, how do you evidence recommendations to the future? It's bad enough evidencing recommendations of the past. But if you say the ASHA program is not working for XYZ reason, say the Nirupam Bajaj study, for example, which says this is it, the reason, and therefore it proposes, therefore you should do XYZ. That therefore you should do XYZ is not really an evidence base. It is after all his extrapolation of how the world should be, and I can contend that what he says, if you do, the program will go worse off than what it ever was. As a contention, one can make that. How do you actually bring evidence to bear on policy recommendations or which are into the future is one central problematic of the business of doing research into the area of policy. And it's not something that I'm going to give you a one-line solution, but I struggle with that with my students. Because at some point when they are making a policy brief, their situation analysis goes very far, but usually their recommendations are off the mark, but they are going by the stakeholders' recommendations. And very often they come with the very things which have not worked, but which are the ruling prejudices of the day. So how do you actually proceed with that? And how do you make, and when you make a new recommendation, there is actually a storm of protest. How do you really look at that? And one of the things that you need to do is to engage with what are known as the policy options and the technical options and take choices on this. And one example that I can say, I think I'm going to really run out of time, is the sickle cell anemia. I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. The sickle cell anemia, in one policy brief we made for Chhattisgarh last time, the dominant feeling there was that the way to do a control program is to screen adolescent girls and give them counseling so that they choose partners that they may have the trait but not go into the disease. The whole policy brief completely disagreed with the approach, said its focus should be on treatment of sickle cell disease and screening is priority in newborns because you will reduce your infant mortality rate in this cohort by 50%, and actually a treatment approach is going to give a far more greater outcome on that. In fact, the adolescent screening approach is a waste of time and money. It actually has no issue on that. In its presentation itself, there was quite an uproar on this. But you had examined 10, 15 policy options and then looked at the evidence for, against each and laid it down. You can say the same thing in the cancer policy for Punjab that we were looking at. If you take something like screening for breast cancer, do you do it at age 30, 45, 50, 55? It's a huge area of contention, and at some point, what are the factors that go into this is not something that, so the research that heads policy options, instead of assuming that there is only one option, is another issue. And then there is the problem of engaging with program theories. A program theory is a narrative of how you think a policy leads to change. And though sometimes it's assumed, there are assumptions made about how, in fact, in practice, and we draw from realist evaluation on that, usually policies are a set of mechanisms that interact in a given context to lead to a set of complex outcomes. And unless you have the narrative of this, you really don't have. And one big example that we have of this is the whole way we looked at the ASHA evaluation, where you actually see we started by sort of charting out, mapping out the existing program theories and found a number of contending rival theories, collected data and then viewed it against these program theories and saw how its interpretation varied among different stakeholder groups, thus helping various groups to get together on that. For example, some people in ASHAs have always viewed her as an activist to whom service provision work is something as a distraction or is going to spoil it. Others have worked her only as a facilitator of services, as a broker, an honest broker of services so that people get their services. A third set of them has looked as actually being able to save lives through skills that and drugs that they have in place. And yet, on the ground, all three run in parallel with different tensions between the three. And at some point, when people are saying the program failed or not failed or worked or not worked, they are assuming one version of the program theory as correct and measuring against that, when actually there are far more versions at all. And therefore, when you actually despair that your research doesn't reach the policymaker, at some sense you are not even conscious of the fact that the program theory that you operate in may be quite different from the program theory that which others are operating in on this. This is one set of issues with this. I had this completely fascinating thing with the NHM evaluation. So we've spent 30, 40 crores on evaluation and people keep coming back saying we should evaluate it. I kept asking them, what will you do different from this particular evaluation, and gave it to them. At some point, They had done the evaluation, they had presented it in the highest panels. Montek had chaired that meeting, it had been commissioned by them, they had spent crores on it. At the end of the day, they had a description of what was happening, and what the presenter, he actually told me that he had actually screwed up and really given a bad report on the NHM. But I looked at the report and I was sure everybody there was scandalized by how good the performance was. Because at some point it was showing things that were happening far beyond what we would have contemporarily believed on that. But he was comparing it against the norm of 100% achievement and saying 30% here, 40% here, 50% here. Everybody knew in 3 years, 2006 to 2009, those levels of achievement are incredibly good. At some point, this whole lack of thing, and it was completely issue on that. So I will skip through some of these. I will just say that I think that there is an issue. But going beyond this, there is the issue of how research institutions describe their agenda. I think I'll come back to some of these on the questions. And their publications make a difference. So in some sense, there are constraints that research institutions face in getting this agenda. Insist more funds, there are a whole lot of problems on that. And I think there is some notion of looking at this thing of problematics that we are trying to look at. It's say there are certain questions that admit of different answers under different contexts and situations. And a research institution can take up a certain area in strengthening, maybe financing, maybe related to human resource management, and develop a whole set of papers that go around putting more and more evidence on the different policy options and the ways we go about it. And this is something that we had done in NHSRC at one time. Thank you.